All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate y'all being here, and I'm very excited for today's event. Today we will be talking with Dr. Amir Yahya Ayatollahi about his book, Political Conservatism and Religious Reformation in Iran, 1905 to 1979, Reconsidering the Monarchic Legacy. Right now, Iran stands at a critical juncture, and it is essential to examine its history and transformations to better understand the trajectories of its future. With this in mind, we thank Dr. Ayatollahi for being here, and I have a letter to read. On behalf of the advisory board and the team at the Iran 1400 Project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The Iran 1400 Project's mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century in order to promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. Your book's insightful observations and analysis of political conservatism and monarchy in Iran will certainly contribute to that mission. It is a great privilege to have you here today and to benefit from your expertise. And all right. Amir Yahya Ayatollahi received his PhD in political science at the University of Vechta, Germany. He has studied philosophy, Islamic theology, and political philosophy in Iran for the last 15 years. His fields of interest are the modern Middle East, Iranian studies, Shiism, theories on state, political power, and democracy. The democratization process, political philosophy, as well as social organizations and movements. Additionally, living among Shiite seminarians provided him with a firsthand invaluable experience of how the public and formal teachings of Shiism are manifested in the political thoughts of clergies in Iran. For today's event, we will listen to Dr. Ayatollahi present his book for around 30 minutes, and this will be followed by about 30 minutes for the Q&A. If y'all have any questions, feel free to email those to media@iran1400.org at any time, or to throw those in the YouTube comments or the Zoom chat. And again, you'll have time to think about those questions right before we get into the Q&A session. And with all of that said, I think we are ready to begin. Dr. Ayatollahi, thank you again. The floor is yours.
Thanks, dear Sydney. It's a big pleasure for me to be here with you and your audience, and with the invitation of Iran 1400 Project. I prefer to directly start the presentation to not lose any time. So I share. Okay. Political conservatism and religious reformation in Iran, reconsidering the monarchic legacy. The introduction: Iranian conservatism, wisdom, tradition, and politics. My book is about assessing the relationship between political structure and the religious establishment before 1979. The Iranian political history is full of discontinuity, and the preface briefly illustrates some fundamental questions and related aspects. The main question is the possibility of a comprehensive perception between political bureaucrats and religious reformers. The book considers the problem of secularism as a crisis that came out of the conflict between the monarchic body and the religious establishment. Iranian conservatism and new religious movements. The main problematic issue does not belong to Iran or any specific region and is a part of the most ancient challenge in history. How can we pursue a mutual constructive process of conservation and change? It seems that reformist bureaucrats strongly believe in a static conservative idea of national security. Accordingly, the belief always has been opposed to any new religious movement. They think that religious alteration is a threat to national security and is harmful to the stability of the land. On the other side, some new religious movements had also revolutionary political purposes, even in the form of overthrowing the state as unjust. The challenge of secularism as an antagonism between politics and religion. The book considers the failed secularism in Iran as a result of a constant conflict between politics and religion, which is embodied in the antagonist relation of monarchy and clerical establishment. Fundamental questions. First, was there any kind of Shia reformism? In what sense? The ambiguity of reform terminology led the thesis to examine the meaning of various terms that are being used in Middle Eastern studies and Islamic studies. For example, the difference between revivalism and reformism and between modernist Islam and fundamentalist Islam are discussed. Two, was there any kind of conservative political tradition? The monarchy was a traditional political conservative approach to govern Iran. After 1905 and the rise of constitutional demands, the Iranian monarchy turned into a state of crisis that lasted till 1979. The thesis rethinks the boundaries of the mentioned crisis. How the secularist plan failed. Was monarchy a barrier to democracy? The book also examines the pretext of failure in the secularist approach and evaluates a Republican cliché that the monarchy was a barrier to democracy. Chapter 1, Political Conservatism. Understanding politics, inevitability, and boundaries. The personification of power is the birthplace of politics. Therefore, politics is the story of human life, in the sense of inventing a better collective form of living to protect individuals from danger. The very life is political, and politics is embodied by it. As Professor Nietzsche articulates, some philosophers were fundamentalists and saw politics as an instrument for peace and the legal justification of power. Some of them wanted to form politics in a firm systematic science, and others defined the political order as a process of actualizing the law of God, or at least a positive formulation and executive phase of a sanctified society, which oriented at divine commandments. Understanding politics, doing politics like living with an eternal chain. Conservatism is a kind of political insight into the recognition of necessities, exceptions, and the legal application of authority. In the conservative approach, an exception finds its way to be solved within the constitutional framework, and the Constitution is ready to face an exception. From the conservative point of view, any crisis on the horizon of politics needs to be treated through lawful solutions. There is a thin line crossing legal sovereignty and entering into the autocratic one, with the excuse of real exceptions. On this ground, reality is supposed to be managed by the law, and the law has to be always dynamic in accordance with reality. Liberal conservatism and religion, Burkean approach toward Christianity. Pursuing Edmund Burke's practical attitude in understanding and analyzing society, politics, and history, he focuses on the moral efficiency of the Christian faith, instead of making himself deal with the theological complexities. Despite his personal religious belief, Burke differentiates himself as a politician and philosopher from a merely ecclesiastical perspective. Chapter 2, Religious Reformation. Islamic Reformation is different from reforms within the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the second chapter, it is clarified that reform has not the same history in Islam in comparison to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Briefly, Christianity gives less importance to ritual, and Judaism is more mythical in comparison to Islam, which has more rituals and more concrete orders. The obscurity in the reformist terminology within the Muslim world. There are two difficulties in understanding the conservative and reformist Islamic movements. Firstly, many reformists in the Muslim world were trying to reinforce the social and political power of Islam. Therefore, it is not a surprise that many reformative plans in Islamic history led to boost the destructive power of extremists, while the latter have more explicit goals with fewer contradictions, and the first, reformists, have a confused and chaotic picture of modernity. That is why the efforts of Muslim reformists usually resulted in the anti-modernization of their countries and raised a sense of hatred toward Western civilization. Secondly, the ascetic plan of Muslim conservatives is also vulnerable to failure because of the political entity of the Sharia or Islamic law. For that reason, any efforts to keep a distance from intervening in politics out of piety, asceticism, spirituality, or goodness must confront the Sharia and justify the necessity of Sharia's suspension in order to defend the real message of the Prophet, which is morality, as some conservatives claim. The historical pretexts and causes of the political Shiism. In the eyes of the Shia, the caliphs are nothing more than illegitimate usurpers of Islamic power. However, the history of early Islam is woven with both Shia quietism and Shia activism. The chapter criticizes Usuli school in Shiism and their bad rationalization, which ended up with the idea of guardianship of the jurist. It also criticized the popular image of Shiism in the 1960s and 1970s as a mere spiritual branch of Islam, which is the minority of the Muslim world and which is mostly apolitical, as emphasized in the anti-political narration of Henry Corbin from Shia history. Young Khomeini, Shia conservatism, and apolitical clergies. Young Khomeini implicitly confessed his own will to power in a treatise in 1944, but he did not exceed the Shia limitation as a restricted guardianship that acknowledged the monarchic position. In his lesson at Najaf in the 1960s, he started his revolutionary shift to claim the general guardianship of the jurist and the devaluation of the monarchy. There is no considerable evidence that Khomeini was ever obsessed or anxious about communist activities in Iran. Ostensibly, he had a realistic estimation of the social tendency in Iran and the supposed little chance of communist ideology obtaining the attention of the public. It is vital to emphasize his characteristics and concerns as a former political activist and a later politician. While others were occupied with preparing a counter-Islamic philosophy in front of Marxism, Khomeini was teaching the principle of clerical guardianship in exile. In general, Khomeini was a man of politics, and his ability to identify the then actual circumstances without falling into abstract analysis is exceptional in Shia history. Chapter 3, Constitutionalism, Religion, and Modernization. Qajar and Constitutional Revolution of 1905 failed constitutionalism. It is important to know that the primitive motivation of the constitutional revolution was economic, and the vigorous revolt did not start by demanding the very constitutionalism. As Professor Amanat illustrates, the arbitrary and authoritative interpretation of the Shia jurisprudence benefited ulama or Shia scholars on many occasions. Under the Qajars, all these achievements improved the authority of mujtahids or senior Shia scholars in an unprecedented way. It is worth mentioning that the first wave of Iranian anti-clericalism as a social and intellectual activity took place during the constitutional revolution. Opposing the Shia clerical authority was the prerequisite to any religious reformations. For as far as a strong clerical establishment remains untouched, there is no chance to run a reform plan on the religious realm. As Freydun Adamiyat, the prominent historian, analyzed the importance of Ayatollah Naini, there were also failed clerical endeavors to prepare a theological basis for the constitutional revolution as juristic justification of the constitutional politics. The loss of clerical privileges could not be neglected as a concrete achievement, and the clerics observed it as a big defeat, which is overcompensated by the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Instrumentalist approach of Pahlavi toward religion, inevitability of instrumentalism. Emphasizing the progressive future of Pahlavi and the regressive future of the Islamic Republic does not mean that the ancient regime was a democracy. In other words, the exclusive attribution of modern to the Pahlavi era does not intend to picture it as a loyal system to the comprehensive perception of modernity, or to deny the vital defects of Pahlavi autocracy. The Pahlavi monarchy made interconnected elements of religion and politics into a modern and almost secular bureaucratic arrangement to push forward a traditional society into an intensive process of modernizing. The intensity of modernization is a widespread allegation against Pahlavi as the leader of the failed Western development, which isolated the rich from the poor and alienated the middle class. The failure is mostly justified because of the occurrence of the Islamic Revolution. The historical logic in this case goes in the direction of founding the argument on a kind of historical determinism. There was a spectrum of causes that led to the turmoil of 1979, and the least of them could be the mentioned allegations. From a pragmatist perspective, there is no escape from an instrumentalist approach toward religion in order to modernize a country under clerical influence. The Shah considers both himself and his father as defenders of such a spiritual plane of Iranians, which is in harmony and conciliation with their mazhab, their ancient culture, and the desire to be a modern and prosperous nation. In an interview, he compares Shia clericalism with similar cases in the history of Christianity. In other words, the Shah defined his position against religious radicalism in general, and he did not consider a specific characteristic in the Islamic will to the power. That is why he decisively denies that Islam is an obstacle to his modernization and reduces the institutional confrontation by personalizing it into the character of Khomeini, whom the Shah referred to as an isolated priest. Even amid his confrontation with the clerical resistance against the White Revolution in 1963, the Shah chose religious rhetoric to justify his plan of development for a traditional society. The realpolitik, the society, and the constitution, the post-Reza Shah period. The post-Reza Shah period is an example of two different perspectives. The one sanctifies the alleged spirit of freedom over the government as the main barrier, and the other defends the necessity of political stability and observes 1941 till 1953, a time of anarchy, terror, and instability. The latter is recognizable by short premierships, mostly lasting less than 1 year, It shows the fragility of the political structure to set a steady government. At that time, Iran faced the emergence and fall of the 13 prime ministers. 2 prime ministers were assassinated by the main Islamic terrorist organization, which also assassinated Ahmad Kasravi, the prominent religious reformist. The very Shah survived an assassination in 1949. On the other side, there is a discourse that obliges itself to defend democracy over stability and autocratic liberalism. The chapter criticizes what is called Iranian libertarianism. In this context, libertarianism means a political philosophy that belongs mostly to left-wing views concerning social issues, regardless of its emphasis on individual freedom. Accordingly, Iranian libertarians are skeptical about political authority and state legitimacy, peculiarly under the Pahlavi era, and exclusively about the controversial incident of 1953. The myth of Mossadegh plays a major role in polarizing the history between good forces and evil forces. They neglected the defects of Mossadegh, including his authoritative policy, weakness toward Islamist discourse, his own conspiracy theories, and his incompetence. They undermine the fact that the Islamist, nationalist, communist coalition appeared at least 3 times during the Shah's reign, 1952, and 1963, and 1979. And the National Front, Mossadegh's party, was present as an active force in all these 3 mentioned historical periods. Beautiful monarchy and sublime theocracy, the political aesthetics of Western attitude toward Pahlavi and Khomeini, the cliché of Pahlavi despotism. The chapter also criticizes the term Oriental despotism, which has lost its explanatory function for decades, and then it illustrates the roots of Western sympathy toward the Islamic Republic as part of the Western aestheticism by appealing to the notion of beauty and sublimity in the philosophy of Edmund Burke. Here we can see how pleasure could lead to beauty as a metaphorical element for democracy, and on the other hand, suffering and pain could be read as sublimity and theocracy. This is the only graph that is published in the book. Chapter 4, from the constitutional revolution to the Shia ideology. Rethinking Iranian conservatism. Historically, we only have the experience of monarchical conservatism before the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Accordingly, this research is based on the assessment of monarchical conservatism and its relation to religious reformation in Iran. The chapter explains the vagueness of the related terminology of revivalism and reformation, which resulted in the difficulty of defining the term Islamism in the related literature. It seems the Pahlavi conservatism observed both plans of reforming Shia and revolutionizing Shia as a barrier to its modernization. As a conclusion, the conservative Pahlavi discourse is, in politics, preferred a similar counterpart with the same conservative function and characteristics in the religious realm, like Shia quietism. However, the fundamentality of Pahlavi's modernization was not passive and could not align itself with the traditional conservative precedents, like the Qajar way of ruling. The chapter examines the ancient Iranian conservatism and its relative tolerance toward religious diversities. Iranian history is almost equal to the history of kingship, and it is recognizable that the importance of kingship in Iran could not detach from the idea that the king has a divine right to rule. This idea does not make monarchy a religious form of sovereignty. Otherwise, there would be no meaning of the political struggle between the royal court and the religious establishment in the global history of monarchies. The chapter also examines Pahlavi conservatism as a contradictory and self-destructive discourse. The defect of the Pahlavi conservatism was an outcome of mistrust, insecurity, hesitancy, and a lack of confidence, which all in their turn were the inheritance of Iranian despotism. As mentioned before, despotism is not a political construct from the above. And simultaneously, its tie with the below demonstrates the importance of acknowledging other determining factors to shape the despotic policy, as is the case of the anti-Shah opposition with its totalitarian orientation. The Pahlavi conservatism overlapped with Romanticism and lacked the coherency and accuracy of the liberal conservatism in the West. Put another way, Pahlavi's conservatism sometimes represented itself as a poetic attitude to politics, other than a consistent political discourse. Liberal conservatism is a philosophy of the now and wants to build a lawful benevolence based on both ancestral inheritance and human knowledge. Therefore, conservatism as a political philosophy has a clear distinction with revivalism, romanticism, and any tendency to create the past in the present. The teachings that were sponsored officially during the 1960s and 1970s as an arbitrary combination of Islamic traditionalism and monarchic pulpits cannot be identified as consistent conservatism. Islamic revolution as a result of antagonism between politics and religion. The Iranian perception of the revolution of 1979 has become an endless polemic and a cureless wound. The public understanding of the downfall of the Shah is a collection of numerous contradictory analyses and antagonist sensations. It discussed in chapter 2 and 3 that the Pahlavi monarchy is still suspicious of welcoming Shia revivalism as its domestic policy to maintain a balance between a communist intellectual discourse and the religious revivalist discourse, which according to its own claim was against both Eastern and Western Bloc. At the same time, the state's official discourse was kind of Eastern nativism in front of Western decadence. In every circumstance and by any kind of ruling, the Pahlavi monarchy would face irreconcilable and robust opposition. The anti-imperialist coalition would never collaborate with the system unless get rid of it. What Professor Mirsapasi recognizes as the erosion of secular politics can be confused with the possibility of social pro-Western politics appearing on the horizon of Iran. The secular politics that was present inside and outside of Iran was inspired by the Western left. The main problem at that time was not the lack of a secular attitude in the opposition, but the presence of a strong anti-Americanism in the form of a secular struggle against the imperial power and its allies. Presenting secular in the atmosphere as a solution to the political deadlock after 1953 is somehow misleading. What Professor Mirsapasi called the third worldist ideology does not seem to be mainly dependent on the Pahlavi autocracy and can hardly imagine not coming into the Iranian atmosphere during the Cold War and flourishing the global left. The anti-Pahlavi mentality, which had formed in an anti-Western ideology, was insensitive about its undesired fact. For example, that the Shah was an internationally independent actor and using a puppet regime or client state could not represent his policy truly. The art of conservation in politics is a mixture of a vast spectrum, including the wise security policy, along with the controlled process of democratization, when the issue comes to the case of the Pahlavi monarchy. Nevertheless, political participation emerged eventually as a self-destructive form of anger or as an anti-Shah resentment. The Islamic Republic and the new formation of political conservatism. Professor Amir Arjomand, in his assessment, uses conservatism as an antagonist term in front of liberalization to interpret the post-Khomeini power struggle. In this context, conservatism is the same as regressiveness. There are numerous analyses of the structure of the Islamic Republic. Some scholars choose the pattern of neo-patrimonial regimes to explain the fall of the Pahlavi monarchy. A neo-patrimonial regime is based on personalized power, is fragile to be reformed, and is vulnerable to revolution, mainly due to its personalistic way of ruling. The attribution to the sultanistic regimes is similar to neo-patrimonialism. There is also an inaccurate theory that the Islamic Republic is a kind of Islamic monarchy based on nepotism, is kind of Islamic monarchy and has some essential features of neo-patrimonial regimes. There are also analyses based on nepotism and the emergence of the new politico-economic elite consisting of the families of the clerical upper stratum. The chapter examines the semi-nationalistic discourse of the Islamic Republic, the Iranian culture, the role of so-called political reformers, religious reformers, who were also politicians within the system, the Green Movement of 2009, and the new patriotic uprising since 2018. Conclusion, fundamental answers. Shia fundamental revivalism instead of Shia modernist reformation. As discussed in chapters 2 and 4, the Shia discourse in 1960s and 1970s was not a reform when we mean to civilize a religion, or a reforming that resulted in civil religion. The Shia discourse at that time is considered in some literature as modern, in accord with its tendency to be equipped by technology to revive a lost power over the socio-political real. The vague terminology is quite recognizable in this case. For example, Khomeini's discourse can be called instrumentalist toward modernity, but it was not modern if we meant to make Shiism a peaceful religious attitude. It was the opposite and turned Iranian Shia history into a period of aggression, hatred, and radical confrontation with the West. Incompetent political conservatism, national romanticism instead of consistent discourse. As analyzed in chapter 4, Pahlavi's conservatism had some similarities to the original roots of conservative policy, but it was a functional and suffered from the lack of a discourse that makes it possible for the majority of Iranians to feel as a part of the body politic. Political passiveness and religious passiveness, the desired Pahlavi conservatism, which resulted in the failure of the secularist approach. One of the conclusions in adherence to the central issue of the book is to assess the relationship between the fear of power and the fear of divinity, that is, religious inner ruler and outer religious establishment. The prosperous interaction between these two spheres of fear is to transform the fear of God into religious self-consciousness and to make a transition from the fear of power to political self-consciousness. What happened in the Pahlavi era was quite the opposite. The fear of God turned into the velocity of political Islam, and the fear of government vanished rapidly and shaped into a massive rage. The passive idea of national security and political stability was the main political conservative discourse during Pahlavi as a secular monarchy ruled over an almost traditional society. Put another way, the Pahlavi conservatism preferred to invest only in the religious piety and apolitical aspects of traditional Shiism. The monarchy prepared the basic socioeconomic ground for democracy, and the lack of political prerequisites belonged mainly to the anti-monarchic opposition. The political self-awareness is a result of political participation, which possibly leads to religious self-awareness, and the Iranian conservatism did not find any historical possibility to actualize it. The case is the same about the upper and lower Iranian middle class. who were not directly involved in the ruling system, but the autocratic system was their only representative at that time and was the only defender of their modern way of life. And the middle class benefited from its secular domestic policy and its peaceful regional policy. However, humans must be aware or must become aware of their benefits based on the feeling that they are part of the system through dynamic socio-political participation. Ultimately, the supposed religious self-consciousness could be finding of the political self-consciousness and consequently could form a combination of religious and political awakening in a constructive way. Hypothetically, the mentioned mixture could prepare and actualize a peaceful transition from the Pahlavi benevolent dictatorship toward liberal democracy. Expectedly, democratization should direct the society into an autonomous and self-sufficient body politic, which is capable of keeping its democratic and liberal values. Put simply, the democratic society grows and develops under liberal values as its second nature. Therefore, democratization is a mutual task between a given civil society and a self-corrigible political structure. The lack of prominent politicians who were more than just bureaucrats, mistrust between different social classes and between the whole people and the state made it impossible to enlighten Iranians about their remarkable social welfare and their unprecedented degree of prosperity and social mobility. That is why Foroughi, the prominent bureaucrats in the late Qajar era and the first era of Pahlavi, expresses with the sense of sorrow in the late Qajar era that Iran has no state and no public idea. Similarly, the saying of Foroughi can be reformulated in the Pahlavi dynasty as follows. Under Pahlavi, Iran has a state, but has still not public idea. The reformulated sentence refers to the lack of dynamic connection and mutual understanding between the Pahlavi state and Iranian society. Put another way, it cannot be neglected that the modernization program did not attempt to introduce a culture of political pluralism and democracy. Nevertheless, the opposition also did not attempt to introduce a culture of political pluralism and democracy. And worse than that, they tried to polarize the political atmosphere with fictional anti-imperialist totalitarian dogmas through systematic lies against the system and committing terror against politicians, diplomats, entrepreneurs, and even ordinary citizens. The end of an era, the inevitability of institutional reform in Shiism, whether theoretical reform takes place or not. In the end, Iran collapsed because of two devastating fragilities: the weak reformist bureaucratic structure and the non-existent religious reforms. The weakness of the reformist bureaucracy can be summarized with the lack of socially confirmed principles that raise to the level of democratic agreement. The lack of adherers who were faithful to the constitution, and ultimately the lack of loyal bureaucrats and politicians who stand with the Shah and the royal family due to earthly virtue of the system or mortal virtue of the system as a benevolent autocracy. Regardless of any future theoretical innovation in Shiism, there is no avoidance to change the Shia establishment by a lawful process and in the light of liberal values in the post-Islamic Republic era. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Ayatollahi. I really appreciate it and excited to get to the Q&A session. For those in the audience, please send your questions in the Zoom chat, and we will have around 30 minutes for a Q&A. But before we get into that, I have a few announcements on behalf of the Iran 1400 Project. Please do go check out our YouTube channel, the Iran 1400 Project. We recently published a video titled 1 Year On, Placing the Woman Life Freedom Protests in the Broader Context of Iran's Women's Movement. And that was a combination of interviews 16 different scholars on Iran about the woman life freedom movement. And it's really interesting, and it's taking parts of these interviews, but we are also about to publish all of the interviews, like the full, 10 to 15 minutes of about 16 scholars interviews. So that will be really cool. Please do subscribe so you can be notified about when those start to come out. Additionally, we recently published a podcast with Dr. Claudia Yacobi. It's called Shifting Dynamics of Sexuality in Iran, Nonlinear Trajectories in Changing Sexual Norms. And the first part is out now, but we have the second part coming out soon. So you can find those on wherever you get your podcasts. It's called the Iran 1400 podcast. And lastly, if you're new to the project, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And you can find out more about the project. And we publish a variety of content on the evolution of ideas and institutions in Iran over the last 100 years. And you can see that all on our website, Iran1400.org. And we have content in English and Farsi. And if you scroll to the bottom of our website, you can put your email in and subscribe to be notified for all of the events that we're having, like the one we're having right now, as well as what other content comes out. And you can find us on social media at Iran 1400 Project as well. So thanks again. Feel free to put those Q&A questions in the Q&A. And I can start off with one of my own while we wait. So Dr. Ayatollahi, like I said, the Iran 1400 project focuses on the evolution of ideas and institutions, but it does that in order to allow Iranians to think more critically about the future of Iran and what Iranians themselves would like. So with that in mind, if you were speaking to the average Iranian who doesn't have any political science training, what would you tell them were the most important lessons from your book when they're considering what future they would like to see in their country?
Well, that's a really interesting and fundamental questions. Summarizing all these researches that formed itself to this book is some kind of miraculous task. I could say to my compatriots that the past has become a burden, a barrier to us as Iranians. It could be different, but we went into this road, and that is why the past, or that glorious decades, are always present in the minds and thoughts and memories and nostalgias of Iranians. But the past should not function as this. We should I do not want to say get rid of the past, because the past is just not a timetable, is not just something that we constructed. The past is our achievement, our failures, but the recognition, the fair, consistent, comprehensive, coherent recognition of its achievements and its failures is really vital to construct, to build something for the country, for Iran, and to transform, whether transform is a really kind of democratic and peaceful term for this brutal regime, but to pass this dark phase of terror, anger, messianic, unfortunately, radical messianism. And when we cannot still picture and analyze the past, that is our contemporary history, in a consistent and in a comprehensive way, we cannot also build something for us, for our children, for the young generations, and for those who will born in the future of Iran. So it is the main things that I can formulate in a kind of simple sentence, but there is much more complexities, much more historical phases that of course is controversial, but I believe in the common sense, at least in the current common sense of Iranians, to recognize the defects of the past, the achievements of the past in a realistic and in an actual way.
Fantastic. That was a great answer, especially I know that can sometimes be a loaded question. So I really appreciate that response. Again, to those in the audience, please submit your questions to the Q&A and we can get to them. The next question that I have for you is, could you talk more about these two, what you call antagonist sides, what they have to do with nationalism in Iran and how they appear through like a nationalist lens?
Okay, yeah, this is also a really challenging question because nationalism is also suffers from obscurity as a term. It applies in a vague form in many occasions. So we have seen in the literature something like Shia nationalism, the nationalism in our region was mainly some kind of the Arab movement, the Arab awakening in the early decades of the 20th century. So for us as Iranians, it began with the constitutional revolution. But when we want to apply the accurate term of nationalism as an ideology, it was not nationalism. We can say it was kind of patriotic awakening, or in some kind of philosophic way to find your standpoint in the new emerging international order. So the Islamic Republic, it is true that the opposition of this regime always claimed that they want to transform Iranian nation into Ummah, into part of the bigger Muslim community. It is true, and it is also paradoxical, and the paradox should be answered by the clerics who rule in Iran, because they are representative of Shia, and Shia is the minority of the Muslim world. And many of their allies who receive millions of budgets, they even do not recognize them as true Muslims because of these sectarist conflicts that rooted itself in the early Islamic history. So the paradox is on the side of the Islamic Republic, how they want to emerge Iranians or to assimilate Iranians into the big Muslim community. But there is a neglected fact about this kind of religious nationalism, that is the Islamic Republic has profited in lots of occasions from it. They wanted to picture us as part of the Muslim community or Ummah, but they also, unfortunately, the biggest achievements was to coin the Iranians as kind of Shia nation. You are a nation, but first and foremost, you are Shia, and you are not Shia in a kind of, as I said before, in a kind of comprehensive historical perception. There is no comprehensive elements in any ideologies, including Khomeinism. So you are a nation, but first and foremost, you are Shia, and you're Shia in an ideology, in a messianic way of thinking. So the opposition should not never ever neglect this fragility, this vulnerability of us as Iranians, to feel ourselves that this regime is somehow defending our position, our standpoint, our interest, our identity, our heritage, because the Islamic Republic claims all of these spheres to be the realm of its policy to defend from the enemies, and it is the most important point that comes to my mind about the nationalism. There is also a widespread discussion about nationalism under the monarchy, mainly the late monarchical line, the Pahlavi monarchy, and as I understood, at the first decades of the Pahlavi monarchy, this kind of let us say healthy patriotism was dominant, but as a kind of symmetry to confront the ideological approach of its adversaries against itself as the system, they also started some kind of nationalistic discourse that the system did not benefit from it. Like I said, in the 1960s and 1970s, the official discourse could not be considered as a consistent discourse, but it was, the determinism is a really kind of bitter and kind of it annihilates the virtuous voluntarism, the human will, but it's somehow true. In that time, there was kind of determinism. I mean, you can call it in a diplomatic way a deadlock. I mean, that system could not find any better discourse to represent itself to the Iranians. And we should also consider it and bear it in mind that a coherent, consistent discourse that can distance itself from poisonous nationalism, from poisonous xenophobia, from poisonous fundamentalism, and from poisonous nativism is somehow based on experience. Before the rise of Khomeini and the emergence of the Islamic Republic and the guardianship of the jurist, we did not have this kind of horror as our experience in this scale. The mujtahids, the senior Shia scholars were powerful, but that was truly different from what we've been through in these decades. I do not want to take more time from other questions. I end it.
Thank you. That was a great response. The next question that I have for you is about the Woman Life Freedom Movement, which I feel like we can't have an event on Iran without at least one question on that. So your book came out in 2022. So I'm sure you hadn't, if it was before September, you hadn't, or if it was, even if it came out after September, there probably wasn't time to add anything about that. But has this current movement in Iran, the Woman Life Freedom Movement, made you rethink anything that you wrote in your book, or has it just confirmed the things that you touched on?
Well, the book published at March 2022. So it was before the latest uprisings and almost the biggest one since 2017-16. But I was under influence of the beginning of these patriotic uprisings since 2018. That was recognizable in 2018. But the birthday of Cyrus the Great in 2016, I think the people gathered in Pasargad. That was the beginning moment of this alarm for the Islamic Republic, that the people of Iran differentiate themselves fundamentally, their patriotic sensation, from all the narrations, propaganda, discourses, reformist discourses, or other discourses of the Islamic Republic, and was a light of hope for us. So I was under influence of those patriotic uprisings, and it emerged in the last chapter, in the last parts of the chapter 4. So I analyzed these patriotic uprisings, its detachment from the Islamic Republic's discourses, Islamic Republic's endeavors to seize the national sensation, the national emotions of Iranians, and what can be its connection to the past, or those pro-Pahlavi slogans, the sympathies toward the past, and what can be recognized in these uprisings, in the slogans, in the solidarity of different classes, in different parts of Iran. All our slogans are that we support another part. Kurdistan shouted the slogan that we support Balochistan. Balochistan shouted that we support those who risk their lives in the capital city. So it is, of course, really hopeful to build ultimately a liberal democracy and a kind of inclusive patriotic discourse to guarantee that the body politic in the future of Iran will not collapse so rapidly and so shockingly as we unfortunately experienced in the 1979. Yes, I mentioned it in some occasions, and yeah, its connection to the past, to the present, and the possible connection to the future, whether the restoration of monarchy or some other political structure. And I also, of course, criticized the radical and still ideological prejudices against the past. I mean, the monarchy, the deeds of that system, yes, that was my considerations about these uprisings.
Fantastic. I think that is a good note to end on, our last question. So thank you so much, Dr. Ayatollahi, for your time today. We really appreciate it. If y'all enjoyed this conversation, please go check out his book. It's called Political Conservatism and Religious Reformation in Iran, Reconsidering the Monarchic Legacy. And stay tuned for our next Spotlighting an Author session as well. That's November 17th. We're going to be talking with Alireza Abiz about censorship of literature in post-revolutionary Iran. That should be a good discussion. Lastly, if you found today's event interesting, check out our website. We have a variety of content in line with what Dr. Ayatollahi talked about today, including a good chunk on modernity and the questions that come with that. And lastly, if you have anything else you'd like to talk with the Iran 1400 Project about, you can email us through our website. We'd love to hear what you'd like to see and who you'd like us to have on next. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope that y'all enjoy the rest of your weekend.